Chapter 2, Police History, Part 4. We said at the end of the last PowerPoint that it was a positive thing during the political era that the police were close to the community. Well, that actually requires a little bit more explanation because it wasn't 100% positive. There were a lot of bad things associated with being so close to the public. The positive was that mostly the police were walking the beat. They were very close to the community. They knew the people within the community. They were very approachable to the people in the community, meaning that someone from the community could just walk right up to the police officer and talk to the police officer. A lot easier than if the police officers were in patrol cars, which they mostly weren't during this time period. And so during the political era, the police and the community were very much in contact and there weren't a whole lot of barriers between them. So we would see that as normally a positive thing, but it certainly had its negative features as well, because the police, in addition to being close to the community, weren't very closely supervised by their police department. So they were pretty much on their own, and this led to many of the police officers believing that they were pretty much a law unto themselves. Who's going to talk back to me? And so they could enforce their own style of law on the streets, which meant that there could be discrimination, there could be bias, there could be excessive use of force. The police officer might say, hey, I'm not going to take this kid down to the jail. I'm going to teach them a lesson myself. I'm going to hit them a couple times upside the head, something like that. And so there were certainly problems being so close to the community. The possibility for, as I said, for corruption, for payoffs, for discriminatory policing, for bias policing. Remember that the police officers during the political era got their jobs not because they were the best and the brightest necessarily in terms of being impartial enforcers of the law, but their main quality that was sought after was their loyalty to their political patron, to the political figure who, as long as that political figure stayed in office, those police officers had a job, so they knew where their loyalty was. Well, again, this could result in biased policing. Bias against some groups versus others. And so even though being close to the public is often seen as a positive thing, it can have its negative features, and this is one of the reasons. These negative features are some of the reasons why the political era was ushered out in favor of the professional era of policing. And as you can see in this slide, I have it listed as occurring from the 1920s to 1960s, but we can see evidence of the beginnings of the professional era much sooner. Again, remember that I said these eras aren't bright line, distinct eras. It's not like in 1920 suddenly we ended the political era and went into the professional era. These are evolutions. We go slowly from one to the other, one era to the other. And so what happened to start to bring about the end of the political era was that the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the elite of society, so the old established elite, not the new immigrants like the Irish, but the elites realized, hey, these low-level political positions, these ward politics, politician positions, they're not meaningless. We thought that they were, but as cities required more and more public servants, so more public jobs like sanitation workers, firefighters, other kinds of public servants, and also including police, that as these jobs grew and grew in number, and as they became more and more essential to the life of the city, the WASP soon realized that if you controlled these jobs, you could control the city. And so the Irish politicians, even though they were at the very low end of the spectrum in terms of the political hierarchy, they nonetheless had a lot of power. So even though these seemed like these were meaningless positions compared to being governor, senator, representative, president, nonetheless these were important political positions. And so the WASP wanted to try to get some of that power back. So it wasn't that they were great. The WASP were great egalitarians who strongly believed in equal application of the law. They were more concerned about, we've lost a lot of political power, how do we get some of it back? And so one way that they could try to get it back with these public service jobs so that they could destroy the public or the patronage system of hiring. So again, the patronage system is where I will give you a job, but you have to be loyal to me. The WASP wanted to get rid of that. And so one way that they did that was to create civil service exams, like we're familiar with today. You have to take some kind of exam if you want to be a police officer. Well, we saw the beginnings of these back in the late 1800s. And so this was an attempt to wrestle away some of the power from the patronage system. But these exams weren't very successful, because you could pass an exam, but what kind of environment were you going to work in if you weren't Irish, if you weren't part of the in-group, if you weren't tied to that politician? You were going to work with coworkers who hated you and were going to make your life miserable. They were going to force you out of the job. So even though you may have done well in the civil service exam, you're not going to last long on the job, even if you get the job. And so the Irish still maintained a lot of control. In fact, the police are so important that even after Irish communities no longer were Irish, they moved on to other communities and new immigrant groups like Italians, Eastern Europeans, Jewish immigrants from Russia. As they moved into the eastern cities and now lived in those neighborhoods that used to be Irish neighborhoods, the police were still largely Irish. Even though the communities had changed, there were still Irish politicians in charge of these Italian communities in Brooklyn, and Jewish communities in Brooklyn and other in Boston, in Philadelphia, etc., etc., etc. So the Irish hung on to these policing positions because of their political power, even though the WASP were trying to take that away from them. But nonetheless, we still do start to see a new era coming in the 1900s, the professional era. And so, as I said, some of this was because of the political struggle between the old established elite and the new immigrants. But there were real reformers, people who really believed policing should be better. We should professionalize it. We should take some of the politics out of policing. We should make policing less biased. And so some of the famous individuals connected with the professional era of policing include J. Edgar Hoover, the longtime director of the FBI, and August Vollmer, who was the police chief in Berkeley, California. He went on to other things, but he initially was the police chief in Berkeley, California. And so on the East Coast, you had still the political era of policing. If you think of the political era cop, you think of a cop who's really streetwise, as we said, close to the public, not really a strict chain of command, not a military type organization for a police department, more of a loose organization. The cop on the street can talk your ear off. They're maybe a little sloppily dressed. Their uniform isn't neatly pressed. Maybe it's got a few mustard stains on it from some hot dogs, whatever. But the professional era was going to be more militaristic, more efficient, all of these kinds of things. And Hoover, especially at the FBI, really tried to promote the FBI's image as really smart, talented, the best of the best who were working the job, and they were skilled in all these crime-fighting tools, And August Vollmer tried to do the same with municipal policing. And so Vollmer is probably the person most closely associated with the professional era of policing. Now, what are some of the characteristics of this era? And as you can see, it's also known sometimes as the Reform era. Well, first of all, let's do away with the patronage system. We're going to hire people because they're going to be good police officers. And good in the sense that they're going to be good crime fighters. And so we want merit hiring and promotion. We want people hired because of their skills, not because of their loyalty to a politician. And so civil service tests and other kinds of merit tests become more important during this period. Also with promotion. If you're going to be a sergeant, you're going to move up to a captain, whatever. We want it because you have done your job well, not because you're really loyal to the politician and then this is a payback for being so loyal. We want state-of-the-art training and technology. So that it's not good enough to just say, here's your badge, here's your gun, go out on the street and police. We often saw that during the political era. But now we want to create police academies. We're going to have training. We want to give the police officers the best technology available. So that means no longer walking the street. They're going to be in cars because they can get to the the call quicker. We want the public to be able to call the police, so we're going to have call boxes and eventually radios, telephones, all these things. We want to have quick response time. We want the police to get there as quickly as possible. We want them well trained. We want them to engage in crime fighting, so what we often call legalistic style policing. So we had order maintenance policing for the political era. Now we're going to do more legalistic, which is our job as police officers is to enforce the law. We are crime fighters. And so we're not there to just keep the peace. We are there to solve crimes, to deter crime. This is really what we're all about. We want to emphasize integrity. So we want honest cops. We want detachment from the public. So in the political era, we wanted the police and the public to be very close, and they were. Here, the reformers are saying, no, that came at too great a cost. All those negative things we talked about just a couple minutes ago, we don't want those. We want the police to go in, basically do their job, and be the police that'll say, just the facts, ma'am, or sir. We just want to hear, we want to come in, what is the problem? How can we solve that problem? Get back out, get back in our cars, and get back to patrolling. So very much a detached presence in the public, in the communities. We don't want to be close to the community. We want to avoid corruption, all of these kinds of things. Well, the problem with that is that detachment turn the police more and more into an us versus the police in the community, into too much of an us versus them relationship. And so by the time we reach the 1960s, we have the Vietnam War raging on. We have protests in the streets. We have both civil rights and anti-war protests. We have all these things going on, and many communities, especially minority communities, are being policed by all white police forces. Even though we were supposed to hire people on the basis of merit, the old traditions didn't die quickly, and so you still had largely police departments that were comprised exclusively of white males. And so what that meant was you had minority communities that were not being policed by police departments that were reflective of them. Instead, they felt like this was an occupying force, and there were a lot of analogies to Vietnam. That the soldiers in Vietnam would often come into the battle, they wouldn't try to hold ground, they would win the battle, be helicoptered in, and then they'd be taken right out after they won the victory. They didn't try to really claim the land, claim the territory. And so they were seen as more on a search and destroy mission in Vietnam. Well, many in the black communities, especially Hispanic communities, Latino communities, they also felt the same, that the police were on a search and destroy mission. So this led to a bunch of riots, a lot of problems, and so by the end of the 1960s, America was questioning what the police were doing, and we had some important government studies that developed and said, we need to change the way we police. There was a kind of rediscovery of the 9 principles of policing. Let's go back. Let's take some of the best things from the political era. There were good sides to the police being close to the public. Let's take that, but let's try to deal with the bad sides as well. Let's make sure that the police are honest, that they're not biased, that they're not discriminatory. But let's also take some of the best things from the professional era, which were the training and the merit hiring and all those kinds of things. And let's really make it merit hiring. Let's start bringing in more women and minorities and other underrepresented groups. So all of these things were kind of the rediscovery of the 9 principles of policing, that the police are the public and the public are the police. We need a partnership. So we wanted to put police back in closer collaboration with the community while still having technology and guarding against corruption. We wanted more proactive policing. Don't just respond to calls. That was often the case in the professional era. Let's wait for that radio call to come in and let's respond quickly to it. Well, let's be more proactive. Let's try to discover the root causes of crime and prevent crime. The problem is, as we develop community policing, and we're going to study in more detail later, that's why I'm not going into much detail now, we never fully implemented it. We still, I would argue, largely do professional era policing. Police are mainly doing general patrol, they're waiting for calls to come in, and they're responding to those calls. We don't have a whole lot of proactive policing. We'll talk more about that when we cover community-oriented policing later in the course. So, are we still in the cop era? Most people would still say yes, although some would say maybe we're in a new post 9/11 era. we're going to just stick to community policing era as our final era of policing.